Welcome to the deep dive. You've given us a really fascinating task today.
Mhm.
We're diving into René Guénon's Introduction to the Study of the Hindu Doctrines. It's a translation from, what, 1945?
That's right, 1945. And the goal, really, was laying out the basics of Hindu thought.
Yeah, it seems pretty dense. So our mission here is to kind of pull out the key insights for everyone listening.
Like a shortcut.
Exactly, and express route to understanding Guénon's main arguments. You know, the differences he sees between East and West, this idea of tradition, metaphysics.
And also the challenges, right?
Yeah.
What to watch out for when studying Eastern ideas.
Definitely. So where does he even begin? He kicks off with this big idea, doesn't he? A fundamental split between East and West.
He does, yeah. Right from the start, Guénon lays out this significant opposition, what he calls the Eastern and Western mentalities.
Okay, and geographically, what does he mean by East and West? It's broad, I assume.
Very broad.
Right.
For him, East is basically Asia, and West is primarily Europe, but also its extensions,
Yeah.
America, Australia, places like that.
Right. So the first big insight is he's drawing this huge civilizational line.
Pretty much.
And he talks about a distinct European mentality. Now, I mean, Europe's incredibly diverse, so what's he actually getting at there?
Well, he does acknowledge that diversity, of course.
Yeah.
But he argues there are still these fundamental shared characteristics underneath it all.
Okay.
Things that shape what he sees as this unique European mentality. And interestingly, he suggests this mindset even affects people of European descent living elsewhere.
Like Americans, you mentioned.
Yeah, he points to Americans as an example. It kind of makes you think about cultural inheritance.
It really does. And he even mentions a sort of unity in this European race, allowing for these comparisons with the Oriental. That's a very sweeping statement, isn't it?
It is, definitely. Very broad strokes.
But what's the key thing for us to take away from this initial setup?
I think the main takeaway is just recognizing the framework he's building. He believes there are these deep, deep differences in how these two massive parts of the world think and approach knowing things.
And that initial idea colors everything else.
Exactly. It's the foundation for the rest of his analysis.
Okay, so we have this fundamental difference. How does he think it happened? This divergence. And you mentioned something about a classical prejudice.
Yes, precisely. Guénon talks about a historical split, a divergence in how the intellect developed in the East versus the West. And what's really fascinating here, and a crucial point for anyone exploring Eastern thought, is his critique of this classical prejudice.
Meaning our admiration for the ancient Greeks.
Exactly, the overvaluation of Greek philosophy in the Western tradition.
So wait, liking the Greeks too much has actually blocked our understanding of the East?
That's his argument, yeah.
Yeah.
He suggests Westerners tend to look at Eastern concepts through like a Greek lens. We try to force Eastern ideas into these pre-made Greek philosophical boxes.
Okay, I see. And the danger there is?
Well, the danger is you totally distort the original meaning, the nuance. It's like trying to translate poetry word for word without getting the rhythm or the cultural feel.
Right, that makes sense. We might be looking for Socratic dialogues or Aristotelian logic where that's just not the main game.
Precisely. And he also notes how the West often prioritizes practical application.
How we can use the knowledge.
Yeah, what's the utility here? Whereas he sees the Orient having this stronger pull towards metaphysics, understanding reality itself, sometimes without worrying immediately about the practical side.
So different goals, different priorities.
Fundamentally different in his view.
Okay, this difference in focus, it leads to questions about history, right? Like, did ancient Greece and India actually influence each other intellectually?
Guénon's pretty skeptical about big claims of direct influence there. Either way, Greece influencing India or India influencing Greece early on.
Why is skepticism? Is it just lack of evidence?
Well, partly. The historical records are sparse, sure. But it's also the huge difference in cultural context. Proving direct intellectual borrowing is really, really tough. It's not just finding a similar word in two texts.
Okay, the evidence is murky. So if it wasn't direct borrowing, how does he explain similarities? Because sometimes you do see similar ideas pop up in different ancient cultures.
Now this is where it gets really interesting. Guénon suggests that these similarities, especially in deep metaphysical concepts, found far apart geographically.
Yeah.
They might actually point towards a common primordial tradition, like a shared source of fundamental wisdom that different cultures tapped into independently.
Wow, okay. A universal wellspring of understanding. That's quite an idea.
It is. It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. Okay, moving to something maybe a bit more practical for researchers. Guénon talks about problems with chronology, with dating Eastern texts.
Yes, that's a key point to be aware of. He really criticizes Western scholars who try to just force Eastern traditions into Western dating frameworks.
Because our way of marking time might not fit.
Exactly. He argues it can lead to big mistakes, misunderstanding the real context and how these ideas actually developed. Our linear, date-obsessed history isn't always the right tool.
So we can't just slot, say, a Vedic text into our timeline like we would a Roman one.
Not easily, no. He stresses that different cultures keep track of history differently. Oral tradition, for instance, was huge in the East for preserving knowledge.
Right. Not always written down and dated in a way we recognize.
Precisely. So you need to approach these texts understanding their own history of transmission, which might look very different from ours.
And then, of course, there's language, the sheer difficulty of translating these incredibly complex ideas.
Oh, absolutely. Guénon hammers this point home. The linguistic challenges are profound.
Because the whole way of thinking is different.
Fundamentally different mental structures, different cultural baggage packed into words. He argues finding direct, one-to-one equivalents for terms is often nearly impossible.
So a translation is always going to be an approximation.
At best. And Guénon warns about the huge risk of accidentally imposing Western concepts onto Eastern ideas through the translation itself.
You might think you understand, but you're actually just seeing a Western reflection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's worried that this superficial grasp, because of language barriers, just stops any real intellectual exchange from happening.
So approach translations carefully. Know their limits.
Definitely. That's a key insight.
Okay, so given all these challenges, the different mindsets, the history, the chronology, the language, what does Guénon see as the sort of general defining characteristics of Eastern thought? He breaks the East down into regions, doesn't he?
He does. He talks about three main divisions. The Near East, which is mainly the Islamic world, the Middle East, and then the Far East China, Indochina.
Different civilizations.
Distinct, yes, but he still sees fundamental unifying principles across them. Despite all the diversity, Guénon believes there are core common threads.
And what are those common threads?
The big ones are the foundational role of tradition with a capital T and metaphysics.
Okay.
And crucially, these are often tangled up with religion, but maybe not in the same way we separate things in the modern West. It's more holistic.
Right. So when he says tradition, it sounds like he means more than just, habits or customs.
Oh, much more. For Guénon, tradition is this whole coherent picture. It's knowledge, social structures, beliefs, all handed down through generations. It's not just what people do, it's the entire worldview that shapes it.
Like the underlying operating system for a society.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Yeah.
He sees tradition providing this fundamental structure for Eastern societies, which he contrasts with the more maybe fragmented and fast-changing modern West.
And at the heart of this Eastern tradition is metaphysics. How does he define that?
For Guénon, metaphysics is basically the knowledge of the universal order, the fundamental principles behind everything. It's about ultimate understanding, going beyond what specific sciences can tell you.
The really big questions, the nature of reality itself.
Exactly. And he argues this knowledge is fundamentally unified and, importantly, intuitive.
Intuitive, meaning like a gut feeling. Or something else.
No, not irrational or just emotional. For him, intuitive means a direct intellectual grasp of truth. Not step-by-step logic, but a direct seeing. And he really emphasizes that the doctrine of unity, seeing the underlying oneness of everything, is central to Eastern metaphysics.
He also compares metaphysics and theology, right? How they relate differently in East and West.
Yeah, he points out that while both deal with the transcendent, their relationship can differ. In the East, metaphysics is often seen as sort of the higher, more fundamental understanding.
And theology.
Theology might be a more specific, maybe more accessible expression of some of those truths. Whereas in the West, especially in the Abrahamic faiths, theology often holds a more central, all-encompassing role.
So the hierarchy is a bit different.
The emphasis in hierarchy can be, yeah. It's a subtle but important point.
Okay. Now, expressing these really deep metaphysical ideas, it must be hard with just ordinary words. He talks about symbolism.
Exactly. Since metaphysical truths go beyond everyday experience and language, symbolism becomes essential. Symbols act like bridges.
To communicate things that literal language can't quite capture.
Precisely. Think of a symbol as packing a whole lot of meaning into one image or sign.
And what about anthropomorphism? Giving human traits to gods or principles?
Guénon suggests that in Eastern traditions, that's often a representational tool.
Not meant literally.
Not necessarily as a literal description of the ultimate reality, no. It's more a way to make abstract principles relatable, graspable for the human mind. The key is not to mistake the symbol for the thing itself.
Makes sense. Making the abstract a bit more concrete for us, this sounds related to the idea of esotericism and exotericism, inner and outer meanings.
It is related, yeah.
Yeah.
Guénon explains that Eastern doctrines often have these two levels. The exoteric is the outer form rituals, stories, popular beliefs, more accessible stuff.
And the esoteric.
That's the inner, deeper meaning. Understanding that usually requires, a certain intellectual ability and being properly initiated or grounded within that tradition.
So there can be layers of understanding. Not everything's just on the surface.
Definitely not. And he also notes that the line between the two, esoteric and exoteric, might be a bit blurrier or less rigid in some Eastern traditions compared to how we think of Western esoteric groups.
Okay. Ultimately, what's the goal of all this in these Eastern traditions? Guenon talks about metaphysical realization. What does that actually mean?
Metaphysical realization. As Guenon presents it, that's the end game. It's a direct, intuitive understanding of those fundamental principles we talked about.
Not just knowing about them.
No, it's about directly experiencing their truth. It's the difference between, say, reading a description of swimming and actually jumping in the water and swimming.
Ah, okay, so it's experiential knowledge, not just theory.
Exactly. And the practices, the rites you find in these traditions, they're often seen as aids, methods to help you move towards that direct, transformative realization.
Okay. Now let's zoom in on the Hindu tradition itself. Guenon spends time just defining the word Hindu, which it can be confusing, right?
It really can be. He stresses it's a complex term. It doesn't neatly map onto Western ideas of a single race or one language or even a religion defined like Christianity or Islam.
It's more fluid.
More fluid, yeah. It's broader. It signifies belonging to a particular, very ancient tradition.
So who counts as Hindu then, according to him?
Primarily, he says it refers to people who follow the Hindu tradition, which is fundamentally based on the Veda.
The Veda, okay.
And he warns against using the term Hinduism as if it's just another urbanism like Western religions, with one founder, one set of dogmas.
Right. So the key is adherence to the tradition rooted in the Veda, not necessarily a single organized church kind of thing.
That's the core idea, yeah.
And this Veda, it sounds absolutely central. He talks about its perpetuity. What's the significance there?
Oh, it's hugely significant. The Veda is the foundational scripture, and a core belief is its non-human origin. The term is aparushya.
Meaning not written by humans, essentially, yeah. Guénon interprets this as the Veda representing this body of timeless traditional knowledge. It's not tied to one specific historical author or even one specific time period.
Which is radically different from how, say, Western scholars might approach the Bible, with historical criticism and trying to find the human authors.
Totally different. He mentions biblical criticism as a contrast. It highlights a completely different way of viewing sacred texts and where their authority comes from.
It's a whole different framework for understanding knowledge and truth.
Absolutely.
And finally, Guénon touches briefly on Buddhism and its relationship to Hinduism. That's often a point of discussion.
It is. His view is that despite the obvious differences, especially on the surface, Buddhism actually shares a common metaphysical foundation with the broader Hindu tradition it emerged from.
So deeper connections than might appear.
That's his argument, and he specifically warns against trying to understand Buddhism purely through Western lenses, like just slapping the label atheistic on it, because it doesn't feature a creator god in the Western sense. Right, that could be missing the point entirely.
He suggests it risks missing the deeper metaphysical underpinnings that might connect it back to the Vedic tradition.
Okay, so bringing this all together, this deep dive into Guénon's introduction, it really throws these fundamental differences into sharp relief, doesn't it? East and West, their approaches to knowledge, tradition, reality itself.
It really does. We've seen his focus on tradition as this all-encompassing thing, metaphysics as intuitive, unifying knowledge, and crucially, the need for real care and awareness when we try to bridge these cultural and linguistic gaps.
Humility almost.
Intellectual humility, exactly.
Right.
Recognizing that understanding another culture means being willing to question your own frameworks. That's a huge takeaway.
Yeah, it definitely feels like we've got a solid foundation now. A shortcut, like you said, to some really complex ideas in Guénon's work.
Hopefully, and maybe thinking about these distinctions Guénon draws, maybe it makes you consider how they might still play out today in cross-cultural stuff or even in your own search for knowledge.
That's a great point. Does it make you want to dive deeper into specific Hindu ideas, maybe? Or compare them elsewhere?
It could spark that interest, yeah.
Yeah.
Lots to think about.
Definitely. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We look forward to unpacking more complex topics like this in the future.